Hello overseers, have you progressed through your technology tree to the point where you need to start using these diamond research points to unlock new technology? These diamond points are called Gyne Points. In this video, we're going to cover everything you need to know about genes, the Gyne Cocoon, these gene towers, and how to get these Gyne Points to further progress your technology tree. After you finish your instinct to unlock the iron worker ant, you're going to get access to this new building under progression called the Gyne Cocoon. You will need some resin to build this building, and if you don't know how to get resin yet, it's over on this jungle island, but that's a little bit out of scope of the video. After you've built your Gyne Cocoon, it's a relatively straightforward building. It turns a princess ant into a lesser gene. We'll go through how to make the princess ant at the end of the video, but essentially once you have a princess ant, it'll walk up this platform, and if you give it a mix of these different castes of ants, which is 15 worker ants, 15 iron workers, 10 drones, 5 pod workers, and 5 pod worker 2s, it'll start making this cocoon and it will start producing the lesser gene. Once that lesser gene has been created, you will need to send it to a gene tower. And once it's slowly made its way to the top of the gene tower, it'll just perch there and wait until the next nuptial flight. That happens every single hour. When the nuptial flight begins, it will turn your lesser gene into these diamond research points. Now, how fast you can accumulate these Gyne Points is going to depend on how fast you can create your lesser genes in your Gyne Cocoon. So we're going to focus on how we can effectively send all of these different ants in the correct ratios into the Gyne Cocoon so that we can efficiently produce as many of these lesser genes as you can every single hour so that you can accumulate these Gyne Points a little bit more efficiently and quickly. The first thing that we want to understand about the gene tower is that we're trying to create ants of different caste in a specific ratio. We don't want to worry about these individual numbers themselves, but we basically want to know that for every 15 workers, we want 15 iron workers, 10 drones, 5 of these and 5 of these in that ratio. The exact number doesn't really matter. As long as they come out in that ratio, then we're effectively sending all the ants into the cocoon correctly. The second concept is that we don't want to send brand new ants to make the cocoon. We want to send all our old ants into the cocoon as they die. So it's important to have these in the correct ratio so that your old ants aren't just queued up here waiting for any of the other castes of ants that might be insufficient. So to manage those ratios, we're going to go through some simple concepts first. Most of these concepts are going to focus on the lifespan of an ant. We're always going to start with a small worker ant. Let's start simple. So we're going to start with just our regular workers, which are made in a combiner. If we have a counter gate from wherever most of your ants are being spawned, and let's just start with an arbitrary number of 5 ants. We're going to get 5 ants onto a trail, and that could be some sort of foraging trail, for example, like this. Obviously, in your real game, it'll be on some sort of foraging path, like for these energy orbs, but for the purposes of this demo, we're just going to send them onto a path like this. Over time, 5 ants are going to saturate this path, and you'd expect 5 ants to be there, since we've got a counter gate set to 5. Now, if we were to take an old gate out of here to get all the dying ants out of here, and send them into a combiner. If we set a divider trail to split these ants into either ends of these combiners and then they turn into our regular workers, when we send these regular workers off to work on some trail, how many workers would you expect there to be on this trail after some time when everything finishes saturating? Well, given the lifespan of a small worker is 5 minutes, and the lifespan of a regular worker is around 10 minutes, since you need 2 small ants to form into a regular worker ant, you'd expect over time that this trail will also have 5 regular worker ants on it. Now, in practice, it doesn't exactly work like this because of the age at which an small ant goes into this. You'll end up with a little bit more than 5, but that's okay. It gives you a rough indicator. Now let's get a second counter gate out of here, and we'll also set that to 5 ants. And we'll set up an analogous foraging trail over here. Let's send those ants to that trail. And now again, we have another 5 ants on this second foraging trail, identical to that. But instead, this time, we're going to turn these ants into iron workers. So we'll get an old gate out of here, and they will go in and become iron workers. Now, if we have an analogous hauling trail out here, or a foraging trail, or whatever you want your iron workers to be working on, how many ants would you expect on this trail now? Well, an iron worker similar to a regular worker also has a 10-minute lifespan. What's different is that you only need one normal small worker to become an iron worker. So given it has double the lifespan, you would expect however many ants are on here, ultimately when everything saturates, you'll have twice as many ants out here. So looking at these trails over time as they saturate, you would expect that you would get twice as many iron workers here compared to regular workers over here. So that's our first 2 ants of our Gyne Cocoon sorted out, workers and iron workers. Let's talk about the drones next. So if we were to take the oldest ants out of here and turn them all into drones, we would need another combiner. Then if we send them into this combiner to assemble drones, the drones have a 10-minute lifespan as well, so you would expect a 1-to-1 ratio of iron workers to drones. So if we were to send another hauling trail out here for the drones, you would expect the same amount of ants here as over here. So that's another ratio of ants done, and that's our third one, and we'll talk about the pod workers at the very end. But we don't want an even amount of workers to iron workers to drones. We want a very specific ratio. For every 15 workers, we want 15 iron workers and 10 drones. So how can we achieve that using this concept of inputting a fixed amount of ants and getting a certain ratio of ants out? Well, let me put some figures in, and it might be a little bit easier to see. So if we want a certain amount of ants here, say 15, and a certain amount of ants here, 15, we want even amounts of ants here and a little bit less drones. But we're turning our iron workers into drones, so that means the ants that come out of here need to be 15 plus 10. So we essentially need 25 ants here, and then some of them are going to go out and as iron workers to feed the cocoon, and some of them are going to go out as drones to feed the cocoon. So essentially, whatever ants we feed in here, there needs to be 25 ants, which is 10 plus 15, for every 15 ants on this trail. Now we know that these ants convert to these ants at roughly 1-to-1, and these ants convert to these ants at roughly 1-to-2. So if we know we need 15 worker ants over here and 25 iron workers over here, that means we need 1.6 times more ants on this trail than this trail, in theory, if they were all 1-to-1. But because these iron workers convert at a higher percentage, in that the normal workers convert at 1-to-1, but the iron workers convert at 1-to-2, then in theory, we should need about 0.8 as ants on this trail compared to this trail. So if I have 5 ants here and let's say 4 ants on this trail, we should get the correct amount of ants that we need on both trails. In that these 5 ants will turn into 5 ants here, these 4 ants will turn into 8 ants here, and that 8-to-5 ratio is roughly that 1-to-1.6 ratio. Nothing here is going to be perfectly precise, so you're just gonna have to bear with it. But if we let this system run for a little bit, in theory, what you should eventually see is the correct ratio of workers to iron workers to drones. Now, you'll get the 25 ants out of here, but we don't want to send them all to become drones as they get old. Again, we need to split the ants in here in this 15-to-10 ratio or a 3-to-2 ratio. To do that, you're going to need a divider gate. So as the old ants come out of here, you don't want them all to become drones, you only want some of them to become drones at a 2-to-3 ratio. To do that, you'll need to get a divider with 5 outputs. Something like this. Then you will want to get a trail of 2 of them linked to send to become drones, and then you want 3 of them linked like this to go straight into your Gyne Cocoon. And that way you'll split the 25 ants out over here into 15 and 10, or into that ratio. Now it's going to take a little bit of time for these ants to get old to see this system in action, but while we're doing that, we can talk about the 4th and 5th caste of ant that you need here, which is the podworker 1 and 2. The podworkers 1 and 2 work a little bit differently to your regular ants because podworkers are essentially immortal. As long as you keep giving them more energy, they will continue to stay alive and do more work. So for the Gyne Cocoon process, we want to create podworkers just to send to make the cocoon. And once again, we need to know how many we need to make. So I'm going to take my podworker assembler and just put it over here, and we're going to create a 3rd trail to deal with podworkers. So once again, you'd have some sort of foraging trail for these guys, and we need to set up a 3rd counter gate for these guys. And once again, we're going to set it up at 5 just to start with so we can get our ratios correct, and then we're going to send these guys onto this trail. Now, once again, once they've finished working their foraging of their orbs or whatever you have them doing, you can send the oldest gates into a assembler to turn them into empty pod workers. Once the empty pod workers come out, we can directly send them into 2 more assemblers to become the assembled pod workers. We can immediately just divide them out of this trail to go here, and one of these will be set to make pod worker 1, and one of them will be set to make pod worker 2s. Now, how many of these do we need? Well, if we look at our Gyne Cocoon, it demands 5 podworker 1s and 5 podworker 2s. So in total, we need 10. So whatever's coming out of here, we need 10 of them to convert for every 15 of these. So if we have 15 here and we want 10 here, that means we need 1.5 times less ants on this trail compared to this trail, right? So if we have 5 ants on this trail, we'd roughly need 3.2 ants on this trail. I'm going to round that to 3. So now we have 3 starting trails, one with 5 and they get turned into normal workers, one with 4, they get turned into iron workers, and one with 3 that get turned into empty pod workers. These empty pod workers are going to come out and they're going to be split 50-50 into assembled pod workers 1 and 2, and that should in theory give you all of the ants that you need for your cocoon. These iron workers over here will come over to this divider and split in a 3:2 ratio, becoming drones, and some of them will just directly go into the cocoon. In theory, if you have your ratios set correctly at the start, you will always have the correct balance of all 5 ants that you need for your Gyne Cocoon. We can test this theory by letting the game run and sending all our old ants from all of these trails into the Gyne Cocoon itself and seeing if we get a roughly correct ratio at the very end of it. And even if we don't, it just means we can very easily adjust these numbers or fine-tune them and get them to a correct ratio that we're interested in. So let's go ahead and do that. So here I've just built a brand new Gyne Cocoon. It's got nothing in it. We're going to create a lesser gene, and I have a lesser gene ready to go. So I'm just going to shove it in there for now. And we have 0 of each of these. Now with my lesser gene inside the Gyne Cocoon, I'm just going to bring my Gyne Cocoon down to this side of the island for simplicity. I'm just going to put it anywhere. It doesn't really matter. And we're going to send all our ants into the Gyne Cocoon as they come out. So first, our pod workers, they can directly go in. For simplicity's sake, I'm just going to directly send my drones in without using an old gate, but obviously in the real game you would use an old gate and this trail would be doing something with the drones, like transporting items back and forth between islands or whatever other work you want to do with your drones, and then the oldest drones will come out into the Gyne Cocoon. But instead of having to wait another 10 minutes, we're just going to directly send these guys out. We'll connect the elder trail over here from our iron ant 3:2 split. So we just get an elder trail going back this way. And I'm going to put them all as separate trails so you can see that we don't have an excess of any particular ant. And finally, we'll get an old gate for our regular workers and a separate elder trail going into our Gyne Cocoon. And now we have 4 trails going into our Gyne Cocoon for our 5 different ants. These 2 pod workers are using the same trail, but that's fine. And then we're just going to let this run for a little while and see if our theory pans out. I just had to reset my Gyne Cocoon one more time to get rid of the pod workers in there because we started off the pod workers a little bit too early. Now we've got our first ant on the elder trail. We will see if everything can keep up in the right ratio. So we'll let it run. Now this system's been running for about 15 minutes or so since I set it up, and we can have a look at the ratios of ants that have walked into the Gyne Cocoon at this point. So we've got about 12 worker ants, 11 iron workers, 6 drones, and we're filled up on the pod workers. I mean, my ratios might be a little bit out. For example, my pod workers might be a little bit too fast, but the concept is pretty much sound. Like you can see the worker to iron worker to drone ratio is roughly correct, right? So you can obviously adjust your pod workers down a little bit. Maybe this should have been 2. But you can see how simply by controlling the front end of all of these systems, the input of small worker ants in some specific ratio, you can control the output of all the different castes of ants you need to put into your Gyne Cocoon without too much wastage. Of course, these numbers and ratios are going to vary drastically. At the moment, we've set it to 5 on our worker ants. We've set it on to 4 for our iron workers, and we've just recently dropped it to 2 for our pod workers. But obviously, these ratios are going to change drastically depending on how fast you want your Gyne Cocoon built, but just build it in some sort of ratio. So if you want to double it, double all the numbers. So set that to 10, set that to 8, set that to 4. Let's see how this concept works in practice now. Obviously, you don't want to be creating loops where your ants are doing nothing, but we can very easily turn these loops into working loops and still apply this exact same concept to get a nice balance in your Gyne Cocoon. So here I've loaded my game from my actual Let's Play series, and we can see we've applied this same concept just in a more complicated and practical manner. So we have our main loop of our small worker ants being spawned, and they're being sent into various foraging loops, such as this one over here, this big one over here, and this one up north. From each of these foraging loops, they're all creating different types of ants. So going through each of these loops, we can see that I've got a fixed amount of ants going into this foraging trail, same as I've shown in the abstract example before. They're going into this loop, and then they're going to, the old ones are going to come in here and turn into assembled iron workers, where they're going to be distributed into various tasks such as smelting and crafting and colliding energy orbs, whatever you want your iron workers to be doing. But off the back of all of these processes, we've got old trails to combine them all back into this loop over here, where we're doing that 3-to-2 split. This 3 split is going straight into the Gyne Cocoon, just like in our example, and this 2 split is being turned into drones. And these drones are just doing some work. They're ferrying items back and forth from my jungle island, and as they get old, they're going to go into this launch pad, which is going to send them over here into the Gyne Cocoon. Similarly, on this side, we've got a couple of different loops, and they're being combined into your regular worker ants. So the small worker ants coming out of here, they're going to get old, become regular worker ants. Those regular worker ants are going to do some sort of work, and then those old ants out of those trails are going to then come out and go into the Gyne Cocoon. Similarly, over here, we've got this floral trail over here set to a fixed amount of numbers. I think we've got that one set to 8, and this one is set to 5. So 13 all up, and they're going to go into here, combine into regular worker ants. These guys are responsible for smelting my iron, and as they get old, they're going to come out and join their friends and go into making my Gyne Cocoon. And we can see everything is kind of nice and in ratio. Finally, our third loop is right down here. We've got 3 ants set up here, a tiny amount compared to the rest of them. And they're going to go forage all of this food over here, and when they're done, they're going to go into this assembler, turning into empty pod workers, going into this assembler, splitting in half, turning into pod worker 1s and pod worker 2s, and they're going to go into the Gyne Cocoon. And as this system runs, we can see my Gyne Cocoon is keeping everything at nearly a perfect ratio, and I've just been observing and tuning these gates over here to get that perfect ratio. So I've got roughly, if you want a guide, roughly 10 ants becoming iron worker ants, a combination of 8 ants here plus the 5 ants here, so 13 ants becoming regular worker ants, which makes sense compared to our example where we need slightly less iron worker ants to worker ants. And then I've got a measly 3 ants over here turning into pod workers. You really don't want to have an excess of pod workers dying because they're going to use up your precious light bulbs. So make sure you undersupply the pod workers if you're going to undersupply any ant. But as we can see, they roughly give you the correct ratio and they'll be producing genes continuously. I don't have my thumper yet, so my nuptial flights are every hour, and with this sort of volume, I can produce 4 genes every hour. The final thing to talk about is where do we get our princess from? Well, I completely keep this system isolated from the princess because the princess is quite easy to make. You simply need a combiner, and a princess just needs 1 drone and 1 inventor. Now, because I know my system creates 4 genes per hour, I roughly need around 4 princesses per hour. So we can just go over here, and where we're getting our inventor ants and our drones, we can use this timer gate over here. And you can set a timer on the gate to however long you want. If you change the mode to minutes, you can set it to a certain amount of minutes. I wanted to produce a slight excess of princess ants, so I've set all my timer gates to 10 minutes. Here, every 10 minutes, an inventor ant that is usually responsible for research will instead go through this timer gate and go into this combiner and become a princess. Now, where's my drone coming from? I have another path over here dealing with the desert island, and the old gates out of that drone path is coming over here. They're getting recycled normally, but we've got another timer gate set to 10 minutes as well. So every 10 minutes, one of these old drones will come out of here and become a princess. A princess has a 20-minute lifespan, so it can just slowly walk all the way over to the Gyne Cocoon. It's not going to die. And we can see here, I have another princess ant ready to go whenever this Gyne Cocoon fills up and spits out the next gene. With this system, you should have reasonably automated your gene creation process, and then you can just let these gene points accumulate in the background without having to do too much manual intervention. You will have to balance out your various foraging trails with the small ants to start with, but once you've got your perfect ratios, then your Gyne Cocoon should be fully automated. Hopefully this video has helped you out, and if it has, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. And if you're looking for something to watch in the meantime, you can check out my Let's Play series for Microtopia on my channel. Thanks for watching.